of business, and that's 1-minute speeches. We have 87 requests for the floor. You should be aware of that. You should be aware of the fact of how difficult it is to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak. And in selecting speakers and the order of speakers, we take into account the time when a given speaker spoke last. We will now give the floor to Elena, Oana, Antonescu. 1 minute, please.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
Thank you, Chairman. The Romanian government is currently analyzing the possibility of levying a tax on fast food, thus hoping that fewer and fewer citizens, and especially children and youngsters, will choose to eat fast food, which can have disastrous medium and long-term effects on the body. Taxes may seem a complicated solution during times of crisis, but if well performed, such an initiative does not merely pertain to taxation, but rather to education. So more and more people learn that their health starts with their eating habits. The funds generated by such taxes should be exclusively targeted towards information campaigns on harmful ingredients and substances. The health systems in the member states have become more and more burdened by obesity-caused diseases, and the link between obesity and fast food is well documented. Encouraging the consumption of health food should thus become a central EU policy, and there should be no delays to this effect. A European program based on initiatives in several member states would be welcome and also very useful, and could lead to a healthier standard diet in the EU member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dear colleagues, please, if you don't want to listen to our debate, I am very sorry, you must leave as quick as possible and not to discuss in this hall, because we want to keep our debate working. Dear colleagues, Mr. Vice President, Libor, can I ask you? No, Libor is... I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. I'm sorry, Isabel. Fine. Proszę Państwa.
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor will now be given to Mr. Higgins. Mr. Jim Higgins, please.
Not present? Mr. Higgins, he is not present. Pan Kalinowski, Jarosław Kalinowski.
Mr. Kalinowski, Jarosław Kalinowski. Mr. President, I would like to speak on the security of supplies of raw materials that are needed to farmers, tradesmen, and the producers of feeds and food in the European Union. One of the key issues, one of the key threats for the European supply chain is the lack of a well-defined supply of GMO, which is still banned in the EU. According to recent studies, up until 2015, approximately 120 GMO species will be grown in the world, and having no solution in Europe will affect the prices of food and feed, and might exclude from the market many EU farmers. A recent example took place in July this year, when trace amounts of GMOs were found in the supplies of soya, which affected the entire feed supply chain, as Europe was unable to supply its own feed and has to import 14 million of tons of soya. Thank you. Mr. Ádám KÓSA now. KÓSA, rather.
Köszönöm a szót. Szeretném megkérni az elnök urat.
President, I would like to ask you, as President of Parliament, to point out to the European Commission that twice I have made written submissions to it over the last 6 months. The first time I received a reply very late in the day. On the 30th of November, I sent in another question to the Commission. I have still not received a reply. I believe that it's very important that the interinstitutional dialogue functions well in the European Union. So could you please, President, point this out to the European...
Thank you very much for taking the floor.
Pan Csaba.
Thank you very much for taking the floor. Mr. Csaba Tajanti will now take the floor.
President, Commissioner Kovács, it's a fine thing that the European Union finally is getting a face. Cathy Ashton will be the Foreign Affairs Minister, but she said only one sentence about China in her hearing, and surely we don't need to emphasize the global importance of that country. Not a single MEP was able to ask a question about China. No one put a question about China, even though at the Climate Change Summit we were humiliated by the fact that the United States and China did a deal behind our backs. It's amazing that the European Council has never put relations between the EU and China on the agenda. So, President, can I urge you to call the European Council and ask them to make an issue of this topic, put it on the agenda, and address this as an...
Thank you. George Sabin-Kutas will now take the floor.
Thank you very much, President. Amongst the priorities of the next European Commission, we should take into account the reduction of differences between member states by coordinating economic and fiscal policies. This economic cooperation needs to continue beyond the economic crisis. And also, we need to keep in mind the fact that inside the EU we have countries which have differently structured economies. Some economies have cyclical movements which are lengthier, and they need more financing than other more mature economies. The Development Pact should include flexibility clauses for analyzing public expenditure for the entire length of an economic cycle, so that the member states are able to invest when this is necessary. Thus, each member state will be able to develop at its own rhythm.
Anni Podimata now.
Thank you, President. I think it's very important that we have a coordinated approach when problems arise in the economies of individual member states. Following the recent crisis in Portugal and Spain, we have very little room for manoeuvre left now. I think it's becoming clear that those countries have been used in an attempt to attack the cohesion of the Eurozone and thereby the European Union. The same mechanisms which paved the way to the worldwide financial crisis are now being initiated with a view to target and damage these very fragile countries. Europe cannot simply assess potential measures designed to reduce the deficit. We now have to envisage the use of or creating solidarity mechanisms at the European level so as to better extend protection to countries in the Eurozone and to move towards genuine convergence. Many thanks.
Tack, herr talman. Från och med början av det här året 0,1% svavelhalt för bränsle.
Thank you, President. I'm very concerned about the sulfur content of fuel in ocean-going vessels or sea-going vessels. and the damage they do to the environment. It's important that the maritime industry should be less harmful to the environment. At the moment, a great deal of diesel fuel is used, or heavy oil, and this applies in my part of the world as well, in the Baltic. However, in the Baltic region, especially in my country, efforts are now being made to reduce maritime pollution, and indeed, of course, we're seeking to reduce pollution in general, especially in urban areas. This is a major challenge for us, we feel. And I believe that in the North Sea and the Baltic we should have a new 6.8% limit on the amount of sulfur.
Thank you. Renate Weber.
Chris Davis.
Chris Davis, please.
Sometimes colleagues in this Parliament make life very difficult for its friends. The Bureau has recommended that we spend, in order to employ 150 more people in the Parliament and the political groups to cope with the requirements of the Lisbon Treaty. A massive increase in expenditure at a time when so many of our citizens are facing public service cuts and tax rises. I've been dealing with co-decision legislation for more than 10 years. I don't believe we need that many staff. I believe we can redeploy and use our staff more effectively without an increase in our budget. All of us who run a council, or Mr. President, a government, know that sometimes we have to live within our means. We shouldn't be doing things for which we cannot account. The test should always be, can we stand up at a public meeting and explain what we are doing to our citizens? I believe in this case we could not.
Thank you very much. Józef Marek Grubarczyk.
Thank you so much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that energy security in the European Union is based on diversification of gas supplies. If we decide to choose only one source in the long term, it will definitely lead us to the loss of an overall balance in this regard, not only as energy security is concerned, but also as overall economy is concerned. I think the post-communist countries understand it the best because they are still under influence of Russia in this regard. The northern gas pipe will, to a certain extent, limit the possibility to develop for Baltic harbours. In this way, we will lose one more potential source for Europe. I'm talking about the harbour in Świnoujście, Poland. Moreover, I believe that this decision will have negative impact on the environment as well. Last year's report shows us very clearly that the northern gas line will definitely have a negative impact on the environment. So I think the European Commission should deal with it again. Thank you, Madam Gress.
Catherine Gress. Pani Malika.
She's not in the room. Madam Attou. The floor is yours. Madam Attou.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je me demande quelles actions.
Thank you, President. I wonder what the EU is going to do to ensure that asylum rights and human rights are complied with by all member states with respect to people from the southern Mediterranean. Many of them come across on very vulnerable vessels, and several thousand Africans die to deafening silence from our part. The Council and Commission, are they genuinely sensitive to these issues, which are human rights and humanitarian issues? Mr. Moratinos' statement about stepping up the security approach and providing extra wherewithal to Frontex, as decided recently by Council, doesn't surprise me in that respect. Ladies and gentlemen, it's incumbent on us to take action to ensure that we can act according to our values. Urgently, we need to act because lives are at stake.
Dziękuję pani.
Thank you very much. Bairbre de BRÚN.
President, negotiations have been
Bhí siad ach go háirithe le hastru coichtaí pólainneachta ó far.
Apologies. The purpose of the talks was to begin implementation of commitments made in both St Andrews Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement, commitments today which had not been fulfilled. I'm happy the talks have been completed and an agreement reached between parties, and I'm sure the European Parliament will also agree with this progress. I hope we can now begin implementation of the commitments that to date haven't been dealt with. This should move us all towards a stable political institutions that will function on a basis of equality, sharing of power and mutual respect. Thank you.
Pan Paul Nuttall.
Mr. Paul Nuttall.
Mr. President, I requested to make this one-minute speech to highlight the terrible effect that fortnightly bin collections are having upon communities in my constituency in the northwest of England. Take my hometown of Bootle, for example, where many families live in terraced houses with no front gardens and little space at the rear. It's crazy that they're forced to put out waste every 2 weeks, and this naturally has caused pile-ups of rubbish because there is no storage space. And if we have a hot summer, you can be sure that this will lead to an increase in vermin, which in turn is a public health hazard. But why am I telling this House? Well, because fortnightly bin collections are the direct result of the EU's landfill directive, which was supported in this chamber by the British Labour Party and the Conservatives. And I, for one, hope that a large number of British voters bear this in mind when they go to the polls in the general election later this year.
Dziękuję panu za wypowiedź. Pan Andreas Müll.
Thank you very much. Andreas MÖLZER now.
President, in just 2 days' time, we will in this very House be debating the question of body scanners. During this debate, we will of course be addressing the question of overall security in airports and our approach to airport security in the European Union. It's important to note that on a repeated basis, the European Union adopts precipitous legislation on the basis of threats to terror, which doesn't lead to any substantive improvement in security in airports, but makes life more and more difficult for travellers. If we consider the situation in railway stations, the situation there is fundamentally similar to airports, but would it appear that within intra-European or intercity travel, there is no real problem apparently in terms of security. So one begs the question as to whether or not there's some exaggeration when it comes to security in airports. It would appear that such measures don't actually increase security, they just produce more problems for travel.
Thank you.
McGuinness.
Matt McGuinness.
Pan Krzysztof.
In that case, Mr. Krzysztof LISEK. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman. As you have said, we will vote on the appointment of a new European Commission, and as you said, this is a momentous occasion, not only related to what we do in the Parliament or as European governments, but also very important for citizens of Europe. And formulating a common foreign policy is especially important. Our Commissioner has a very important job to do, and we have two challenges here. One is Ukraine. Regardless of the outcome of the election, we will have to formulate a new policy of the EU towards Ukraine to allow a full membership in the EU in the future for that country. Secondly, Belarus. Unfortunately, several hours ago in Belarus, we've seen another violation of human rights. The police entered the Polonia house to prevent the Poles in Belarus from acting. Mr. Adrover now.
President, last December, the European Union and the Kingdom of Morocco signed an agreement on the liberalisation of trade in agricultural products. We only found out about this agreement through the media, unfortunately, but we've had now an increase in quotas of tomatoes imported into the European Union from Morocco, which I would reject completely, because time and again, the Kingdom of Morocco has failed to meet its commitments with the European Union. This is a situation which has not been recognised, not been dealt with by the European Commission, nor has the European Fraud Office been adequately involved. Time and again, the European Commission has ignored the needs of the producers of tomatoes in Murcia, Alicante and the Canary Islands and the whole of the south of Spain. There are not adequate plant health inspections on the imports of Moroccan foodstuffs into the European Union, and these controls need to be established. President, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to denounce what is happening in Portugal at the moment. At the moment, it's clear in Portugal that if you listen to the media, that there is now going to be a government plan to control the media, television stations, radio stations and the written press. And this is endangering the freedom of expression in Portugal. This week, Mario Crespo, a journalist, was censured by his newspaper at the suggestion of the prompting of the Prime Minister, José Sócrates. José Sócrates, our Prime Minister, now has to stand up and declare that he has no intention of censoring the freedom of expression in Portugal. At the moment, Portugal is not a country where there is rule of law. It is a country where there is rule of law by the executive at the wit and whim of the Prime Minister. We want a country where we have true rule of law in Portugal.
Véronique De Keyser.
Véronique De Keyser now.
Le 27 janvier.
President, at 2 in the morning on the 27th of January, a gas explosion rang out through the historic centre of Liège. I was there with some of my colleagues on the city council, and we escaped by a miracle, but 14 people lost their lives in the explosion, and there were tens of injured and 500 who were evacuated. I would salute not just the courage of the families, but also of the firemen and all the rescue workers. And in that connection, I would like to recall that the status of fire brigade workers is not uniform across all of the European Union, and in my country, as in other countries, this is not regarded as an at-risk profession. I would call urgently for a European statute or status for fire brigade workers, given that these are decentralised in many countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these words, for pointing our attention to that tragedy that took place so close to us in Belgium. It's a truly tragic event. Thank you again. We sympathize with all the families of the victims. Thank you again. Mr. Rosario CROCETTA.
President, ladies and gentlemen, I would speak to highlight the serious nature of the situation of the running down of industry in various manufacturing centres in Sicily, in particular the Termini Imerese factory belonging to Fiat in Sicily. Now, they've been subject to low wage cost competition and Asian competition. Deindustrialization is a serious phenomenon in widespread areas of the European Union, and I think that it's high time now that we reconsider the non-intervention line so far adopted by the Commission and work up measures in a package to support the EU, a major and substantive package. The Commission and Industry Commission Tajani are the people concerned.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jelko Kacin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Thursday, the 4th of February, the Parliament of Fyrom passed the declaration of support to the European Parliament resolution on Srebrenica, which we adopted by an overwhelming majority a year ago. The resolution commemorates and honors all victims of all wars on all sides in the last decade of the last century. The parliament in Skopje is the third parliament in the Western Balkans to have confirmed and passed the resolution with 70 votes for and only 1 vote against. We should welcome this. Fyrom wasn't involved in any way in this tragic event, so their act should be seen as a civilized gesture of solidarity, and it deserves respect and admiration. The Sobrania's decision is an expression of sorrow with regard to all victims and a message about our common responsibility for a better and more just future for all the countries of the Western Balkans. This should be a model to the other countries of the region. I would like to express gratitude to the colleagues in Fyrom for their political courage and contribution to reconciliation in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for information again about another tragic event. I will now give the floor to Michail TREMOPOULOS.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε, θα ήθελα να τονίσω ότι σε αυτή την περίοδο.
Thank you, President. At this critical moment, at a time when we have an economic crisis in many countries, and that in certain countries such as Greece this crisis is reaching severe proportions, I think it's important that we adopt a proportionate approach when it comes to equal opportunities for men and women. Women have been particularly hard hit by the recession. In recent years, great efforts have been made at the European level to create new regulations and rules to promote equal opportunities. All too often, however, these new legal possibilities are not incorporated in national law and not used by member states. So despite our unstinting efforts, there are ongoing efforts to try to lead to an ever-growing gulf between men and women. Many women are disadvantaged at work when it comes to their rights. This is why I believe that we need new rules which really do.
Thank you very much, Mr. ZIOBRO.
Dziękuję za możliwość wystąpienia, gdyż chciałbym wystąpić w ważnej sprawie związanej z kosztami polityki klimatycznej. Unia Europejska konsekwentnie projektuje.
I would like to speak about a very important issue concerning climate change. What's significant here is that our policy has much impact on the economies of member states, and considering the structural differences across economies in the EU, it's quite clear that the burden borne by individual countries will also differ widely. The new member states have done more than enough to reduce gas emissions. In the case of Poland, we have brought it down by 30%, not the required 6%. The reductions in older member states were at the rate of 1%. The European Commission should therefore take into account the various costs of adaptations in individual countries, the costs that have already been incurred by individual countries. Thank you. The next speaker is Joe Higgins.
President, the Irish government is going to impose VAT of up to 21% on public services supplied by local authorities, services like waste collection and recycling. The European Union forced the Irish government to impose these new taxes. They will place an even heavier burden on the ordinary working class and poor people who are already paying very dearly for the crisis in capitalism in Ireland. In addition, the government intends to impose new charges on water for home holders. They could be between 500 and 1,000 euro a year. This is a terrible new blow to the living standard of the working class. But in addition to that, it's preparation to privatize the public water supply in the future. I am warning the Government of Ireland and the European Commission, who are in favour of such charges and privatisation, this will not be accepted. There will be a huge boycott campaign. The power of the ordinary people of Ireland will be against it. This will not be accepted.
Thank you very much. Nikolaos SALAVRAKOS, please.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε, αύριο ψηφίζουμε τη Νέα Ευρωπαϊκή Επιτροπή.
President, tomorrow we shall be taking a vote on the European Commission, and we'll be also looking at how far we can progress towards a United States of Europe, and I really hope that we'll have a new form of governance, a bit more credible to the outside world and inward as well. And we need to look too towards a common economic policy. We need to look at the way member states relate to each other, what sort of solidarity exists between them, and what is the future. I think there's a great deal of caution with respect to the extension any further of the European Union and issues like immigration. These are crisis issues for Europe, and they need to be dealt with not in domestic political terms but at a European Union level. And that connection, I'd like to suggest that a major priority for the Commission's work... The speaker is interrupted.
Mr. Luis Ponte.
Voorzitter, dank u wel. Voorzitter.
Thank you, President. Just a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to Auschwitz, like you yourself did recently, and that gave me the chance to see some of the terrible things which happened there. I must say I was extremely surprised to hear that a few days later, on the official news broadcast of the Palestinian Authority, Jews were criticized, and it was stated,
The Prophet says,
the Jews are the enemy of all humanity. The Prophet says, kill the Jews. These are disgusting words which I heard, and I think that we can't allow this to go without criticism. The fact that this so-called state television quoted the Prophet calling on people to kill Jews would, in my view, be perfect justification for preventing the sending of any more development money to that country. I think the European Union must do its utmost to close the tap now of development aid until we have an official retraction of these terrible words.
Thank you so much. And now Mr. Nuno TEIXEIRA.
Thank you, President. The Green Paper on the reform of the Common Fisheries Policy has already been talked about by my colleague Mr. Neves from the Azores. And this new Green Paper is going to spark up a debate on an industry which is very important for the outermost regions of the European Union, especially Madeira. For Madeira, it's important that we distinguish between small-scale fishing fleets and industrial fishing fleets, and the way they are both dealt with. There has to be positive discrimination with respect to access to our waters. Especially, you should have the economic zones of each country that's close to its shoreline, restricted to its own small-scale fishery fleets. Otherwise, you're going to have unsustainable situations, both environmentally and socially, in these regions. If you look at the fisheries in the outermost regions, it's important that they enjoy support, more support than they're getting now.
Romana JORDAN.
Madam Cizei.
Honourable President, the European Union is full of minorities, and national minorities are very important. Indigenous minorities represent 8% of the population, and an additional 6.5% is immigrant minorities. Before the last two enlargement, 12 member states had to prove that they fulfilled the criteria on the rights of minorities. However, the states that were already members were never subject to any controls as to their minority policies. This is an inequality. Lately, the Slovenian community in Italy, Austria and Hungary has been subjected to a lot of pressure due to cuts in the financing for their activities. This is why I call on Europe to
adopt a new, more serious approach towards the minorities issue, because the new Lisbon Treaty gives us the legal basis to do so. I therefore call on the European Commission to prepare a plan on how to fulfill the provisions of the Lisbon Treaty on the protection of minorities.
Pani
Anna Zaborska.
Slovensko je ohrozené výstavbou megakasína so zavádzajúcim názvom Metropolis.
President, Metropol is a new project for a huge casino. Slovenia, Slovakia and Hungary don't want to approve this issue. And if the project's going to get off the ground, then that obviously doesn't help. But the Slovakian parliament has fought against this resistance. They want this multifunctional centre to be built because it's also got a congress and a park. It's not really a mega casino. So how can this project be banned or overruled like that? How can one take action against that sort of resistance? There's fears about prostitution and other negative issues around a mega casino. I would like to support the protests of the Slovakian people on this issue.
Thank you so much. Estelle Grelier.
Pani Daciana Octavia Sarbu.
Thank you, President. Certainly, the name of Rosia Montana is more and more familiar to the EU institutions and to the EU citizens. We're speaking of an area in Romania with historical monuments protected by UNESCO. We have cyanide-based mining threatening the integrity of this site, and this cyanide-based mining is again a new perspective, a real perspective. And the Romanian government said that the destruction of this area can be considered to be acceptable. I am addressing the EU Parliament and the EU Commission, and I'm asking you to take into account the intervention, your potential discussion with the Romanian government so as to stop a human and natural disaster. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Vaughan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to speak on energy policy. As a previous speaker said, securing future energy supply is a vital issue for all of us. And to solve this problem, we must look to a wide range of technologies, not just one, not just gas. Obviously, renewable energy will have its part to play, whether it's wind, biomass or tidal power. But also nuclear and CCS must play its part as well. And therefore I welcome recent initiatives from the UK government. It has recently brought forward a number of projects looking at new technologies for renewables, but also nuclear and CCS as well. And I believe that these policies will secure the energy supply in the UK for the future, and I would see this as a model for the rest of Europe. Certainly, Mr. President, I do not believe we can put all our eggs in one basket. We must have a wide range of technologies, and I would urge colleagues here to do that in the future.
Dziękuję panu. Pani Giommaria.
Thank you so much. Madam Ugias.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. After the world financial crisis broke out, the Commission tabled its proposals that we are now discussing with a view to improving fighting tax evasion. And the idea is to increase transparency across all fiscal systems of the EU using an exchange of information relating to assets. It's a sound proposal, but let's recall that just a few months ago the majority in the Italian Parliament adopted a tax shield hiding the identity of tax evaders, and that with respect to people liable to income tax. There are rules here which offend honest citizens, and if in my party, Italia with Values, and in a democratic party, we have tabled a complaint with the Commission. we need to be sure that action is being taken. So I'd ask the Commission to be brave and to take up its responsibility and declare invalid the Italian tax shield system and ensure that people pay tax where it's due.
Thank you so much. Katarzyna Grez.
Pan Marek Henryk Migalski.
Mr. Migalski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak on a topic that has been touched upon, but I would like to reinforce it. In the Polish House, which is one of the seats of the Association of Poles in Belarus, a search, an unlawful search is going on, which is an act of repression against the Polish minority in Belarus. Mr. Chairman has personally intervened there as Angelika Boris was punished with a very high penalty, and I thank you for that intervention, as it is our duty to support that organization. I would like to appeal for the Council, the Commission, and Mr. President to intervene in cases of human rights violations in Belarus, the violations of the rights of Poles there, as well as others, which should be very important for us in the European Parliament.
Ferreira.
Thank you, Mr. Ferreira.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente. Nas últimas semanas assistimos à intensificação de uma insidiosa.
In the last few weeks, President, we have noted that there was an ideological campaign being run to try and get member states to balance their budget. And like in the past, there have been fresh attacks on wages and salaries, workers' rights and social security systems. Last week, tens of thousands of workers took to the streets to demonstrate and call for increases in pay and in favour of proper pension systems. Of course, the public books need to be balanced, but as the economy grows, we must put an end to injustice in terms of the redistribution of wealth. I think it's necessary that we can put trust in a better future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologise, my machine wasn't working for a second. My estimable friend and Yorkshire colleague Edward Macmillan Scott a few weeks ago brought the chairman of the International Panel on Climate Change to this Assembly and presented him as a legend in his own lunchtime, a top climate science guru, and I have to say he certainly looked like a guru to me. But it turns out he's a railway engineer who writes mucky books. Now, I've got nothing against railway engineers. Some of my best friends are railway engineers, and no doubt they read mucky books. Not the point. But it might explain, perhaps does it not, why the IPCC has come out with so much absurd nonsense in the last few years. Would it be not a good idea if the Commission perhaps were to write to the IPCC and suggest they got a new chairman, perhaps a tad better qualified?
Dziękuję bardzo. Pani...
Thank you so much, Madam Morvai.
Köszönöm szépen, elnök úr. Néhány perccel ezelőtt Anna Záborská képviselő.
Thank you, President. A few moments ago, Mrs. Záborská referred to a major investment project involving a mega casino, a planned project involving foreign capital. In Hungary, in Budapest, a leading figure in non-parliamentary opposition has been involved in opposing this project. And over the last 12 months, a large group of people involved in this opposition have been detained by the police as part of their investigation. No evidence has been produced against them, and since habeas corpus has not been invoked, the investigating judge has not even verified the nature of the evidence available. This is something quite scandalous, and I find this unacceptable in the European...
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. The next speaker, please.
Thank you, President. I just want to elaborate on an issue which is of great importance to me. It's to do with national parliaments and cooperation with the European Parliament. And if we're interested in a recovery in the economy and getting public finances back into order, then we're going to have to try and cope with this financial crisis, and the strength of the euro, cohesion in the eurozone, and inequalities between different economies are all part of this, together with the solidarity mechanisms which need to be harnessed and extended. Social dialogue between the European Parliament and national parliaments is something which is meant to achieve common objectives and to answer common responsibilities for the eurozone. These are shared at EU and national level. We need to take the proper decisions which can be properly implemented to achieve the long-term objectives. We need to ensure the right decisions are taken nationally, so the political costs of such initiatives need to be shared. Thank you very much.
Señor Presidente, me refiero a la Carta Europea.
President, I'd like to draw your attention to the European Charter concerning the rights of victims of terrorism. Back in December, a commitment was made by the Commission to promote a European Charter for the rights of terrorist victims. On the 10th of January, Mrs. Malmström picked up on the declaration made by President Barroso and declared it was a positive declaration. He made it clear that he would extend his full support on behalf of the European Commission and the Council to the victims of terrorism. We would like to welcome and commend these initiatives. The time has come now to move from declarations to acts. In just a few days' time in Salamanca, the 6th International Conference on the Rights of Victims of Terrorism will be held. I would like to welcome this, and I would also like to ask you, President, to reiterate that commitment on behalf of the European Parliament. Many thanks.
Pani Marc Tarabella.
Thank you so much, Madame Tarabella.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Véronique De Keyser has just recalled the tragedy in Liège of the 27th of January. I won't rehearse what she said again. Of course, I pay my respects to the victims and the rescue workers who deserve their own statue. But what worries me here is that the owner of the building had no insurance, and I just wanted to draw attention of the Commission to the fact that before talking about mandatory fire insurance for all citizens, we could look at civil liability insurance, mandatory such insurance for damages that you could do to other people, sometimes not intentionally, but sometimes because of neglect. And I think in terms of consumer protection, the Commission should act. That affects citizens first and foremost. They need to take action. It could be a Commission initiative or one from this Parliament. I will see what colleagues will support me to the effect that all citizens should have to sign up to civil liability insurance for damages they may inflict on others. Thank you.
Dziękuję, pani Sonia Alfano. To jest ostatni mówca, pani Sonia Alfano.
Sonia Alfano, the last speaker.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Natural gas is subject to a regasification plant to be built in Trieste, and the regasification system being used has some shortcomings. According to a meeting on the 27th of January, a meeting between the Commission, Slovenia and Italy indicated that there was an issue with the plant. The official minutes drawn up by the Slovenians had a different story to the official record of the meetings. This regasification plant is going to be put in an inappropriate site, and the necessary protection policies haven't been properly followed. The emergency plans and the involvement of public authorities in dealing with emergencies haven't yet been properly dealt with. Safety and environmental issues haven't been taken on board properly, and there are certain rules which haven't been followed involving high-risk industrial plants, and the protection and safety measures are not in place.
Proszę Państwa, o 15 minut przedłużyliśmy nasz...
Colleagues, we have extended by a quarter of an hour the one-minute speeches session. Now we will move to the next point on the agenda, and I would like to give the floor to Mr. Rouček. He will chair the meeting as of now.
Takže kolegové, dobrý večer. Jeden Slovan...
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So one Slovene language will replace another one. So first we listen to Polish, now we listen to Czech, and now we are going to have a joint debate on taxation. First, we will discuss the report that is submitted by Ms. Magdalena Alvarez on administrative cooperation in the field of taxation. The next item will be mutual assistance for the recovery of claims relating to taxes, duties and other measures, submitted by Mr. Stolojan. Then we'll talk about optional and temporary application of the reverse charge mechanism in relation to supplies of certain goods and services susceptible to fraud. And now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Alvarez. You've got 4 minutes.
Señor presidente, queridos colegas.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union is based on the principle of solidarity between member states. One clear example of this solidarity is to be found in administrative cooperation in the field of taxation. This is considered to be one of the keystones of the way in which the European Union operates. The idea is to create a sense of trust and confidence between member states and their administrations. This has to be based on a sense of confidence and the certainty that other member states will help tax authorities and make it difficult for tax frauders or evaders to hide them. Tax fraud and evasion has very serious consequences in the economy of a country. It reduces their ability to raise money and instigate revenue. It's very important to set an example to citizens about the need to respect tax legislation. All the effects of tax evasion are extremely worrying in the European Union, and according to most recent assessments, the cost of this is some 2 billion euros per year. This is twice as much as the cost of the recovery plan as proposed by the European Commission. In other words, we find ourselves faced with an enormous challenge, something which we have to face up to with a real sense of resolve and determination. It's true to say that the current directive did represent